Hello, and welcome to another episode of AI in the Classroom Daily, podcast helping educators make sense of AI without the hype. I'm Dan Cogan-Drew, and I use AI as a thinking partner preparing each of these episodes because I think the best way to talk honestly about AI in education is to work with it openly. So today's episode comes out of a piece that Ethan Mollick published yesterday on his Substack called Choosing to Stay Human. And if you read Mollick regularly, you'll recognize the territory. He's been writing for a while now about the difference between using AI to do your thinking for you and using AI to push you to think harder. The new piece pulls those threads together and lands on what he calls a defining challenge for the coming years, being intentional about AI, making a conscious choice about when to use it and when not to, rather than reflexive dependence or reflexive avoidance. So Mollick draws on a couple of studies, including one from his Wharton colleagues that names the phenomenon explicitly. They call it cognitive surrender. You've probably heard this term. People stop thinking about problems and just let the AI do the work, even when the AI is wrong. We've talked about this on the show before in episodes 25 and 26, when I walked through the Shaw and Nave research on the same idea. So in one sense, Mollick's piece is consistent with ground that we've already covered in the show. But there's something new in the piece that I think pushes the conversation a step further, and it's the thing that I want to spend the bulk of this episode on. Mollick argues that the defaults are being set right now by the AI companies, by employers, by the people teaching AI literacy. And once a generation of workers and students has built habits around those defaults, the defaults will be very hard to reverse. He says the most important thing we can do is keep asking what to hand over and what to keep for ourselves, and not to expect anyone else, including the AI, to answer that for us. So that's what I want to spend some time on today, because reading Mollick's piece, I had a personal reaction to it that I want to share here, and I want to draw a distinction that I think is worth your time as an educator who's making these choices every day about using AI, when and how and when not to. So the reaction I had was that I read the piece this morning, and I asked myself a question. I've made 49 episodes of this podcast to this point. I make a new one every weekday. I use Claude as a thinking partner in producing each one. And reading Mollick, I wondered, honestly, have I surrendered the cognitive work of making the show? Is my voice still mine, or is it averaged out into something that just sounds like a thoughtful person talking about AI in education the way every AI-generated post on LinkedIn now sounds like a thoughtful person? So I ran an experiment. I asked Claude to give me a multiple-choice quiz on the contents of my own podcast. 10 questions drawing across all 49 episodes. I told it to focus more on framing choices than on content facts, because the framing is where I think the editorial work actually lives. When I took the quiz, and I scored 9 out of 10. The one I missed was about a structural pattern in how I close episodes, which I'd argue is really more format than substance and not that much of a concern to me. On the questions that asked about the editorial arguments I made, the frameworks I applied, the specific examples I chose to anchor each of the pieces, I got all of those right, and most of them with high confidence. It also asked me to reflect when I gave an answer. Was it low, medium, or high confidence? So this result was reassuring, but where the episode gets into what I actually want to share with you, because it's as soon as I had the quiz score, I realized that the quiz told me one thing and didn't tell me something much more important. The quiz tested whether the work had left what we might call a trace, whether I could recognize my own editorial decisions when I saw them next to plausible wrong answers. And yes, I could do that. The trace is there and I can identify it. But I don't think that's the same question as to whether I could still produce the work cold, that is, without the AI. The quiz didn't test whether the generative muscle is still there and one that I've been building or letting atrophy. It tested whether the memories are still somewhere to be found, and it turns out that they are. So this is where I want to draw the distinction that I think makes this episode worth a few minutes of your time. We have a much older idea about academic dishonesty in education, which is plagiarism. Plagiarism, I think, is a discrete event. You can run a scanner on a piece of writing. The scanner tells you whether the words match someone else's published work. If they do, you have a finding. If they don't, you don't. The transgression in a specific sentence or paragraph that you can point to. Even when academics have been accused of plagiarism and claim they don't recall copying the passage, you can still find the artifact. The words are on the page, and that's a pretty bright line that you can point to. Cognitive surrender isn't that. There is no scanner. The transgression isn't any single sentence. It's really more of a gradient. It's like a slow shift over time towards producing work that you didn't generate in a voice that isn't quite yours, with judgment that's a little less than your own. You can't run a plagiarism check on your own thinking. There's no published source to compare it against. There's just you before and after, and the question of whether the after is still recognizably the same person doing the work. I think that's what makes this much harder than plagiarism. Plagiarism is binary and leaves some evidence. Cognitive surrender is more of a gradient and a gradual shift, and it leaves the work looking, for all intents and purposes, fine. The episode comes out, the lesson plan gets used, the feedback gets written. Nobody knows that the generative work happens somewhere outside of your own brain because the artifact looks the same either way. And it can even fool you into thinking it looks the same. So what do? I don't have a clear answer here, but I want to share 3 exercises that I've been thinking about since I took this quiz, because I think they might be useful to teachers, coaches, and leaders who are thinking about similar questions that I've been thinking about today. The first is, let's say, a recall test. Can you remember without your notes open what you argued in your last lesson plan or the last bit of feedback you wrote, the last rubric that you built? If a student or a colleague quoted you back to yourself, would you recognize it as your thinking? That's the test that I wanted to run on myself. It told me that the trace was there, but it didn't tell me much beyond that. So I think of it as a starting point. That's helpful, but it's not really giving me the satisfaction I was looking for. The second is what I would call a generativity test. I think this is much harder. If you close the AI tools and you just look at a blank page, can you still produce the kind of work you've been producing with the AI's help? Maybe it's not as fast, it's not as polished, but it's recognizably the same voice and the same judgment. That's what I haven't done yet, and I'm not really sure how I would do on that, but it's a commitment I'm going to make to actually try it. And to be clear, I am going to use a little bit of AI when I do this because I want to talk my answers into existence. So I am going to use speech to text to capture what I'm thinking on this blank page, but I'm not going to be using Claude in the same way that I've been using it to date. I'm going to use a technology called Whisper, which I use frequently. That's an aside. The third, I'll call a boundary test. If you take a piece of work that you produced with AI in the loop and you put it next to a piece of work you produced before you started using AI, you read them both, and can you tell the difference? Now, this is not a blind test, obviously, because you're the author of both and you know which ones you're reading. But you may notice a drift in your voice, and if the second piece sounds more like a generic version of the first, then that's the kind of slippage, that gradient that I think Malik is talking about. Now, none of these instruments are scanners. They're very rough approximations. They're better than nothing. And I think right now it's going to matter. The rough instruments, let's call them, that we use are going to matter more than any institutional check. Because as Malik is saying in his piece, the institutions aren't going to figure this out for us. The AI companies are designing for frictionless use, which is the opposite of what cognitive friction would require. The employers are setting defaults right now because they have to, but they haven't really figured out the domain, and there hasn't been a lot of planful work around this. And the AI literacy field is still trying to figure out what it's even teaching as a domain. What is AI literacy? So I think the diagnostic, if there is one, has to be one that we're going to run on ourselves, and we may have to each invent some of this for ourselves. It would be interesting to see the field of AI literacy start to develop diagnostics for creators, authors, teachers, anyone who's making anything these days, to be able to run on themselves, to understand the extent to which they may be verging on cognitive surrender, even if they're not aware of it. So, a few questions as we close, and I would love your thoughts on this. When was the last time you produced something for your classroom, a lesson, rubric, piece of feedback, without AI in the loop? I recently wrote an op-ed, and I chose not to use AI, specifically because I wanted to put my brain to the test, and I wanted to make sure the language sounded like me. Second question, when you read it back, did it sound like you, or did it sound like the AI you've been using? And the third question is, if you've tried any version of the generativity test that I described, how did it go for you? What do you think you'd produce? If you haven't, what's your best guess? Do you have another test? So I'm very interested in your answers because I'm still, as you can hear, wrestling with these questions myself. I think these are boundaries that we're all going to have to negotiate, and figuring out the right way to map this jagged terrain across the different domains and the different use cases, I think is going to be work that each of us has to actively engage in. Otherwise, we're going to be victims of our own cognitive surrender.